So when I vote, it feels like a sacred act. I actually get a little nervous. Like, am I going to make the right decisions? Did I research enough? It feels so empowering and unique to stand in that privacy of the voting station, although I have voted by mail for the last several elections. I always get a mail-in ballot just in case. And then when I can, I go to the polling booth because it feels like a sacred act. When I turn my ballot over to the attendant, see it go into the ballot box, and of course get my sticker, I often get teary. I love that when I meet my wife outside of the room, she's often teary as well. We talk about that it feels sacred. I feel proud. I feel invested. I feel like my voice matters. I feel like I was part of a great institution and history. And I don't take for granted my ability to do so. 100 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to. So here are the things that we all know. 100 years ago, last Tuesday, was the adoption of the 19th Amendment. The words are, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." 39 words that changed the landscape of our democracy. 39 words that gave me, and potentially more than half of the people in this congregation, in this worship space right now, the right to vote, to determine their own representation, to say they had autonomy over their lives and their futures, that their husbands or fathers could not speak for them any longer. And that's a whole nother sermon, right? 39 words that capped off the efforts that took 72 years of active organizing. 72 years. That means that very few women who kicked off the suffrage initiative in full swing at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 were alive when the vote was actually allowed. So we get to think about that. Like, what do we have to learn that it took 72 years for that? Whose legacy are we carrying forward of people who never got to see the actual vote for themselves? What struggles do we have in our society, in our life, that may take our whole lives to work on? And if we're not around when things are actually coming to fruition, and we can argue that they're never totally there, which ones are worth us doing anyways, even if we won't see it in our lifetimes? Unitarian Universalists often claim Elizabeth Cady Stanton as one of our own. Despite her religious upbringing, it never really sat well with her. After a trip to Niagara Falls as a young adult, she said, "My religious superstitions gave place to rational ideas based on scientific facts and in proportion as I looked at everything from a new standpoint. I grew more and more happy day by day." Does that sound familiar for any of you? She maintained that logic and a humane sense of ethics were the best guides to both thought and behavior. Stanton not only rejected Christianity, but all religions, and please remember what religions meant in her time. She said, "All religions on the face of the earth degrade her," meaning women, "and so long as what woman accepts the position that they assign her, emancipation is impossible." Furthermore, she believed the natural result of her study of theology was to inevitably reject traditional religion. She loved arguing religion with family members and friends, And she was proud to recount discussions with her family and siblings about and how she eventually convinced them. She said, together they passed through every stage of theological experience, from the uncertain ground of superstition and speculation to the solid foundation of science and reason. As lovers ourselves of democracy and reason and the voice of conscience, we believe that voting is our superpower. We are not the only ones. From 100 years ago, when women got the chance to vote, to our children talking about voting as a superpower, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I give you Hannah Soleil, a daughter of Sarah Hutelin in our congregation, with a special appearance by her ninja brother, Nolan.
Hi, my name's Hannah, and voting is super important because it makes us superheroes that kick bad guys' butts. Once upon a time, girls couldn't vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She had a great big meeting, and she talked about how important girls are to be able to vote. I think it's important to vote. Voters can change the world. Ninja. I'm a ninja. Look at my weapon. Let's have a
Thank you, Hannah. It's 100 years since women got to vote. But is it really? How much white privilege is in that statement? Did all women get the right to vote? Of course not. That's not how our history works. The reason that the 19th Amendment saying that gender shall not be a factor in allowing people to vote, and the 15th Amendment saying that race shall not be a factor in allowing people to vote even had to be said is because the way to maintain power is to restrict access to voting. And we are still working against voter suppression and for full access to the polls now in 2020. By 1920, owning land, your race, and your gender were outlawed as restrictions. But that didn't mean that they didn't come up with tons of other restrictions. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses that kept many Black women and men voting. Unchecked intimidation and the threat of lynching further sealed the deal. So let me pull out just the grandfather clause, a term that we still reference today and probably shouldn't. It basically asked voters if their grandfather voted, and if so, they could vote. So if your grandfather was a white land-owning citizen with influence, he probably voted, and you could too. If your grandfather was Black, he probably had been prohibited from voting due to the bondage of slavery. So even though the rules had changed, there was another rule, this grandfather clause, that meant that restrictions were still in place. It was an insidiously evil way to continue the disenfranchisement and the exclusion of slavery. It didn't happen in every state. Black women managed to vote in California and Illinois and New York, where women's suffrage became law before 1920, and even more registered and cast ballots after the 19th Amendment. And the situation changed when women organized due to some great leaders. There's some stories, a lot of stories that I read this week. I just took in all of it. In St. Louis, Missouri, Fannie Williams was a teacher turned organizer. She set up a suffrage school at the city's Black YWCA, the Phyllis Wheatley branch, named after the 18th century enslaved poet. There, Black women prepared for their chance to register, teaching one another how to pay poll taxes and pass literacy tests administered by begrudging officials. Newspapers reported that nearly every woman in the city, Black or white, registered that season. In Florida, educator and women's club leader Mary McLeod Bethune traveled her state in 1920 to encourage other Black women to register, only to be confronted by brutal opposition at each step along the way. Black women managed to join voters' rolls, but the intimidation continued. On Election Day Eve, white-robed Ku Klux Klansmen marched into the grounds of Bethune's school in Dayton, aiming to scare them away from the polls. But the women turned out to vote anyway. They took their courage from their leaders like Bethune and each other. And then let's talk about our Native Indigenous siblings. The vote was much more challenging there too. In 1887, there was a Dawes Act that was passed. This was an act to further assimilate Native Americans into the white man's culture. They felt like that was needed before our Native folks could vote. And if they were assimilated into the mainstream culture, then that would make their vote. I don't even know what to say that would do. The effect of the Dawes Act was devastating. It provided for the dissolution of the Native Americans' tribes and as legal entities, the distribution of tribal lands to individuals. It established Indian schools where they were taught reading and writing, but also the social and domestic customs of white America. The Dawes Act destroyed many traditional cultures and societies, as well as the loss of as much as 2/3 of tribal land. The Snyder Act passed, supposedly giving Native Americans the right to vote in 1924, but still not really, because states got to decide who got to vote. It still took over 40 years for all 50 states to allow Native Americans to vote. Arizona didn't change its state laws until 1948, and the final state that gave Indians the right to vote was New Mexico in 1962. Even with the lawful right to vote in every state, Native Americans suffered from the same mechanisms and strategies like poll taxes and the literacy tests and fraud and intimidation that also kept African Americans from exercising that right. There was a Voting Rights Act in 1965 and subsequent legislation in 1970, 1975, and as recently as 1982. That's what gave voting protections the reaffirmation and strength. Today, way too many of our citizens still don't have the right to vote. The majority of states have some kind of felony disenfranchisement laws, saying that if you've ever been convicted of a felony, you lose your right forever, even if you've served your time in parole. Others have less restrictive rights, but still have felony restrictions on it. I worked hard on Amendment 4 in Florida that just changed 2 years ago. And even then, it was hung up in court by the governor. Today, way too many Americans don't have access to vote, or their access was denied so long that they don't have a culture of voting. For way too many, their access to the polls is determined by where they live. And because of the US's long history of housing segregation, it's correlated with their race. There are new voter ID laws resurging all the time, and the purge of voter rolls in some states following a 2013 Supreme Court ruling that rolled back the provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 have deprived both men and women of color to the right of vote. Now, I want to show you something. I'm going to do a screen share here. This is a map of Maricopa County. Now, it's fuzzy and blurry. I get that. You're not going to be able to see all of it. Here's my cursor here. I am right here in Paradise Valley, right here. The green areas are where 80% or more of voters have turned out to vote. The red areas is where 50% or fewer people have turned out to vote. It's a huge distinction. You can kind of see where you are. So Paradise Valley is here, a little bit of the central Phoenix corridor. This is all the Scottsdale area. And over here, you can see these are a lot of tribal lands, and down here as well. And then, of course, if you think about all of the other areas in Phoenix, we've got Glendale, Ahwatukee down here, and you all can probably figure out where some of the challenges are. And you can see that a lot of these areas are of Native people, of our Latinx siblings, of our Black residents, and that voter turnout is so low because it takes a long time to build a culture to vote, and there is so little access and such strong work being done to stop people from voting. This is a map that is very upsetting for me. And it's a map that a number of organizers in Phoenix are going to be using to help target certain areas where we might be able to increase turnout in the Phoenix area. Stay tuned for more information about that and think about what that means for you. So let's step back and celebrate the 19th Amendment, the power of women and how much better our democracy is when we are all included. And let's extend that to all of our nation's diversity, all of the faces that we saw in the Democratic National Convention this past week. And let's understand that those in power will always try to subvert the people who could take away their power. We're seeing that with the attacks on the Postal Service during a pandemic that makes mail-in voting all the more important. And like so many ways, let's be willing to engage in our history. Not just look at the surface, not just say, yay, the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. We can do that, but we can also hold the work that we have to do. We can do both. We can hold both things. We will be talking about voting more this fall, since democracy is such a key part of our UU principles. And I believe that this next presidential election is the most significant of our lifetimes. And we are also looking at how we can work with community partners to help address these voting inequities in our area. May we honor our voting sisters, and may we work to be our best selves in democracy. May it be so.